and let me back up just a little bit then. FEMA came out of the old Civil Defense Office, and so one of its original missions was black ops and military, and it got kind of a bad name in other circles of government because people saw it as oppressive or, potentially a shadow government, and Mount Weather and moving Congress and a nuclear disaster and all of that was certainly part of their mission. But when the Cold War ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall in the 1980s, there was a revisioning of what emergency management really should be. And during the 1970s and 1980s, there were a number of pretty big disasters in the U.S., especially hurricanes and floods. And so there had always been a preparedness and response office in FEMA. But when the Berlin Wall fell and there was no longer the need to be so focused on war planning, the all hazards movement really came to the fore. And with that came the development of the Stafford Act under General Becton. And when the Stafford Act was presented to emergency managers in the 1980s, everyone said, this is a lot of new information. How are we going to assimilate all of this? And so FEMA began offering training at Emmitsburg. They'd had other kinds of training there before, but they really began to move into the emergency management arena a lot more strongly. And at the same time, the International City Management Association recognized that emergency management was a really important part of what cities do. So they hired Jerry Hupner, who was one of their ICMA staff, to be the editor of the first edition of the emergency management textbook. Now, ICMA has a program for people who would like to become city managers. So if you're an analyst or a manager in a city, you can sign up for courses that will lead to a certificate. And the individual courses are some at the discretion of the student. So everybody has to take a course called the Effective City Manager. But then you can see what direction would you like to go in your career. And so there's a course on fire administration, there's a course on police administration. And through the development of this book, there was now a course on emergency management. And ICMA believed that the emergency plan for a city was like the budget for the city, that it encompassed every department. Every department had a significant role to play, and therefore it was the city manager's obligation to run that activity. And so they put forward the concept that the emergency manager should work directly for the chief executive officer of whatever organization he or she was in. And so in California, we saw that Bill Megovich, who was our first real professional emergency manager, worked directly for Governor Deukmejian. And for the 8 years that Bill was there, he did everything he could to try to professionalize emergency management, to offer conferences and training opportunities and encourage people to go back to FEMA's Emmitsburg campus, which was all paid by the feds at the time except your meals, and to get some of this training, to learn what other people have done instead of sitting in their office and trying to invent something. So the Green Book, as it was called, was part of the Green Book series of ICMA that encompassed all these different types of administration. But the Emergency Management Green Book became sort of the Bible for people who were involved in professional emergency management and who'd come at it from an administrative perspective. Now, of course, there were people who came up through the ranks in police and fire who had a little different evolutionary trend, and they tended to see emergency management through the lens of response. It was about, what do we do when the siren goes off and how do we save people's lives, and then they went home. But the city manager had to recognize how would they get their money back from FEMA and the state through the Stafford Act. Who would know what was eligible and what kind of documentation you would need, and work with the rest of the city to collect it and get it processed. And so the Green Book tried to focus more on the higher level administrative issue, not the emergency response, because the philosophy was police and fire perfectly well know their jobs. Public Works perfectly well knows their job. And as they're so fond of saying, a disaster is business as usual, only more of it. And of course, we've seen through events like 9/11 and Katrina that the more of it can be catastrophically more, and that normal mutual aid may be overwhelmed, even though in a robust state like California we say, well, we have so many cities and counties that can provide mutual aid to each other. There's still some threshold beyond which we won't be able to manage either.